Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. While I was doing research for my last video about Nintendo's first and second party studio lineup, I came across a really interesting story about the ownership of Pokémon. See, most people would assume that Pokémon is owned by Nintendo, but it turns out that's not true. Or at least, they don't completely own Pokémon. It's complicated, so let's just get into it. To get to the bottom of this, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, to where all good Pokemon stories start, the adventures of a 10-year-old boy. And that boy is Satoshi Tajiri. He grew up in Tokyo collecting bugs and insects as a pastime. He would go out to the forested areas and abandoned air raid shelters and just collect them and learn about them. And this obsession became so well known in his community that the other kids started calling him the Insect Professor. But as Japan's urbanization continued, more and more of these areas where he would go out and collect bugs got paved over, until the point where he really couldn't do it anymore. So in about middle school, he started playing arcade games, and he fell in love with them immediately, especially Space Invaders for whatever reason. And he actually started planning his own games, and even won a contest hosted by Sega to come up with the best new game idea, which to me kinda just sounds like Sega was trying to get somebody else to do their work for them. But his obsession with video games then got to a point where he actually ended up cutting classes so frequently that in order to get his high school diploma, he had to take makeup classes. And after that, he didn't really want to go to university, so instead he did a 2-year technical college and walked out with a major in electronics and computer science. And what did he do with that incredibly technical degree? Well, he started a fan-made video game magazine, of course, and he called it Game Freak. When he first started out with this, he had to write it by hand, and he would photocopy it over and over again and staple the individual copies together and hand them out. Then he started selling them for $2 and so on and so forth, and he slowly grew this magazine until it became something that people knew about, and he was able to start bringing on contributors, most notably Ken Sugimori, who would go on to become the artist of the fantastically drawn first 151 Pokemon. With Game Freak now performing decently well as a magazine, Tajiri was able to start thinking about the next big step. And so one day, him and close friend Ken Sugimori are sitting around talking about how most of these games we write about are pretty much garbage. We could definitely do something better than this if we put our minds to it. And so they set out, bought all the equipment necessary, started bringing on employees, most notably composer Junichi Matsuda, and they started making their very first video game, which was very quickly picked up for publishing by Namco. It was a little game called Quinty. If you don't recognize the name, it's because over here in the West, it's got its name changed to Mendel Palace, which you also probably don't recognize because it was just a very small scale puzzle game about flipping tiles. It performed decently well, but the fact of the matter is that it was just nowhere near what Pokemon would end up being. And the idea for Pokemon wouldn't come to Tajiri until about 1990, when he saw the Game Boy. And he envisioned the insects that he collected as a child crawling back and forth between two Game Boys on the link cable. And just like that, the idea for Pokemon was born. And he took that idea directly to Nintendo, who told him that they really didn't like it or understand it, and that they didn't think it was a good idea. But because he was at this point a semi-notable game developer, they were willing to trust him, and so they agreed to publish it. That's right, you heard me correctly. If not for Quinty, a game that nobody watching this video has likely ever heard of, Pokémon may never have existed. That's absolutely ludicrous to think about. But the thing to take away from this is because Nintendo didn't really believe in this project, they didn't invest in it financially. They were willing to support it in terms of publishing it, and they even sent Shigeru Miyamoto over to help mentor Tajiri to make the game, but financially speaking, there was very little help coming from them. And so, because this game took so long to make, 6 years to be exact, money started to become a real issue. Tajiri barely had enough money to pay his employees over that time period, and he himself didn't take a salary for almost the entirety of that 6-year period. Instead, he lived with his parents as kind of a mooch, which us millennials can probably relate to pretty well. But that being said, if he wanted to get this game out and continue to be able to pay his employees to do so, he needed an investor. And that investor came in the form of Ape Incorporated, the company that we now know as Creatures Incorporated, which you've probably only heard of if you've watched my previous video about the Nintendo Studios. But in case you didn't, let me give you a quick refresher. They are the people who originally created the Mother or Earthbound series, but since becoming associated with Pokemon have really only done support work for it and all the 3D models for it, because frankly, Pokemon is such a big franchise that they're making more than enough money as is. But with Creatures now investing money into the project, he was able to pay his employees and get this game out. But unlike Nintendo, Creatures was immediately smart enough to take a piece of the franchise rights for themselves. And so, with Game Freak making the game, Creatures as the producer, and Nintendo as the publisher, Pokémon Red and Green finally hit store shelves in 1996. But the game's media mostly didn't pay any attention to it and didn't bother to cover its launch. You see, the Nintendo 64 had hit store shelves that same year, and so the game's media assumed that the Game Boy was a dead console and that therefore any games coming out to it weren't worth talking about. But the sales for Pokemon Red and Green continued to grow, and they went faster and faster, and it sold almost entirely, seemingly, off the word of mouth of children. You see, yes, the Nintendo 64 was a fantastic console, and it was the new hotness, but it was also expensive, and kids don't have jobs, so they can't buy new expensive consoles. But a lot of them already had the now old and cheap Game Boy. So when one kid bought Pokemon Red and took it to the playground, then all his friends saw how cool of a game it was, and then they would buy it, and then their friends would buy it, and so on and so forth. And because trading Pokemon was at the core of the game's design, remember that seeing the insects crawling back and forth across the link cable was really the entire idea sparking point for Tajiri. Certain Pokemon were exclusive to one or the other version of the game, either red or green, meaning that many of the kids would end up buying the game twice in order to catch all of the Pokemon for themselves without having to trade. And before you knew it, it just exploded, and it became a media empire with a manga, an anime, a trading card game, toys, plushes, you name it. And the person in charge of handling all of these licensed deals was named Tsunekazu Ishihara from Creatures, and he was very quickly overwhelmed by just the sheer quantity of deals coming through. And so, 2 years after the release of Pokemon Red and Green, all three companies, Game Freak, Nintendo, and Creatures, realized what they had on their hands, and they all co-founded the Pokemon Company to manage the Pokemon brand, with all three companies involved having equal ownership over the IP, with Ishihara as the president. So to answer the question, Pokemon is owned by the Pokemon Company, but the Pokemon Company is equally shared between the three companies that made Pokemon possible. The creators, Game Freak, the financiers, Creatures, and the publisher, Nintendo. They also have a split ownership of all Pokemon related trademarks in Japan, but over here, if you look it up, it looks like Nintendo has sole ownership over Pokemon related trademarks because they handle all overseas deals. Because of the three companies, they're the only one with an international presence. And so, Pokémon, the passion project of Satoshi Tajiri, based on his childhood love of collecting insects and his obsession with video games, a game that Nintendo did not originally believe in, a game that the news media didn't bother to cover, a game that bankrupted Tajiri to the point where he had to live with his parents and collect zero salary for 6 years, has grown to be the singular highest grossing media franchise of all time. And number 2 is not even particularly close. And his original passion project, Pokemon Red and Pokemon Green, remain to this day the highest selling video game in Japan of all time. There you have it. I realize that this turned out to be more of a retelling of the story than just a simple answer to the question, who owns Pokemon, but I think it's important to understand the context of how this strange three-way split ownership came to be. And I sincerely hope that you found this story as interesting as I did. Let me know why you did or didn't down in the comments below, and while you're down there, please consider giving this video a like, sharing it with a friend, or better yet, subscribing to the channel, because your support really does mean a lot to me. But until next time, I'll see you around.